Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode of HeebeeJeebeezTV. My name is Ashley, and if you're new here, we like to talk about stuff like true crime, the paranormal, and unsolved mysteries. Now, today's case, we're going to dive into a very notorious true crime case that actually took place in Canada. Now, if you're Canadian, you might remember this story. It was super controversial. I remember when it happened, it was all over the news. People couldn't stop talking about it, and I was actually living in the city where it took place. And I can tell you that people were extremely paranoid about what was going on. People were looking at their neighbors, trying to figure out if it was someone they knew. It definitely had people on their toes. But before we get into the video, I just want to send you guys a quick reminder to please comment, like, subscribe. And if you guys are interested, I actually launched a TikTok, same username at HeebeeJeebeezTV, where I do short recaps of a lot of the videos on my YouTube channel, but I also create unique content on there, short stories about true crime, paranormal, and unsolved mysteries as well. All right, so let's get into today's story. Now, today we're going to talk about this guy here, and his name is Russel Williams. So he was born in Worcestershire, England on March 7th, 1963. Now, like many psychopaths, many serial killers, many murderers, they often have some sort of traumatic event that causes them to become this way, or a series of events that builds up in their life that, eventually boils over and they lash out. But the strange thing is that for Russel Williams, the same thing cannot be said for him. He had what seems like a fairly normal childhood. When he was fairly young, his family, his mother and father, ended up moving to Canada in a small town called Chalk River, where his father worked at a nuclear research facility. Unfortunately, though, I guess this would probably be the most significant thing that happened in his childhood, is that his parents ended up getting divorced when he was only 6 years old. His mother then quickly remarried. She ended up marrying a doctor, and they moved out of Chalk River to Scarborough, which is actually a suburb of Toronto. In 1979, when Russell was 16 years old, his family moved again, and this time it was much further away. They ended up moving to South Korea for his stepfather's work. Fortunately for Russell, he was going to one of the more elite private schools in the country, Upper Canada College, and they had a part of the school that was reserved for international students that provided room and board. So that's what he ended up doing. He ended up going to school in Canada for part of the year while his parents were in South Korea. Following high school, he went on to study at the University of Toronto and graduated with a Bachelor of Arts in 1986. So the year after he graduates from university, he decides to not really use his degree, and he actually joins the Canadian Forces. And he really wanted to focus and specialize on flying. And by 1991, he had actually been promoted to captain. And he would repeat this pattern throughout his career. He continued to climb the ranks of the Canadian military and really outperform a lot of his colleagues. In 1999, he was promoted again to major, and this time he was moved to Ottawa, where he served as the multi-engine pilot career manager. Then in 2004 came another big promotion. This time he had been promoted to lieutenant colonel, and he had been moved to Trenton, Ontario. This would be his home for the next few years, but throughout his career, he did go to multiple different cities, including Ottawa, Gatineau, and even Dubai. So like I said earlier, he had spent his career climbing the ranks. He took his job very seriously, and it didn't go unnoticed. Those around him would describe him as actually being an elite pilot, a climbing star, and he was so well respected that he was actually entrusted with flying some of the most important people in the world, including the late Queen Elizabeth, Prince Philip, and the Prime Minister of Canada at the time. However, during this entire time, he was fooling everyone while he was pretending to be this stand-up guy, being a top-notch citizen, outperforming people, pretending to be an honorable person. Secretly, he was living a double life. After his arrest, psychologists took a closer look at him and his behavior because they found it extremely odd, and we'll get into this a little bit later in the story. But they found it extremely odd that there was no real catalyst that sparked all of these events. Usually, like I said earlier, people who commit these sort of heinous crimes have some sort of traumatic childhood or a triggering event. And they usually start committing smaller crimes when they're younger, and it progresses as they get older until it gets to that, that point where they're committing the worst crimes. For Russel Williams, it was very much the opposite. There was no catalyst. There was no reported pattern that could have, told us about his behavior. There was no lead up to what he committed because he started committing these crimes when he was in his mid 40s, which was very, very odd. However, what doctors did agree on is that he was a man with some very dark and strange fantasies, also known as a paraphilic. They also recognized that he was a man that lacked empathy, but who was also very intelligent and disciplined. And these are some of the traits that helped him get away with these crimes for as long as he did. And sadly, the traits that helped him get away with these crimes were also some of the characteristics that helped him excel in his work. So what happened? Well, the earliest trace of his crimes go back to 2007 when he was living in a town called Tweed, Ontario. By this time, Russell had been married to a woman named Mary Harriman, and they didn't have any children, but they were living a comfortable life. They had a nice home, they had cars, they lived in a nice neighborhood, all while he was still serving his job in the military. Down the street, there was another family, and they happened to have a young teenage daughter. She was around 12 years old at the time. And Russell and that family had gotten pretty close. They would hang out a lot, weekend barbecues, they would have dinners at each other's homes, and they would even go fishing together at some nearby lakes. However, Russell took advantage of this relationship since he was able to gain an inside perspective into this family's routine. He knew what they would do most days. He was aware of when they would be home or when they would not be home. And he took this as an opportunity to break into their home 3 separate times. And what he did inside was quite disturbing and very unusual. So after breaking in, what he would do is that he would go straight for the daughter's bedroom, and he would start looking for her underwear drawer. And once he found this, he would start looking through them, picking out his favorites. He would take pictures of all the underwear. And the really weird part is that he would try them on, and he would lie in her bed naked with all of her underwear on in different poses, taking pictures of himself. And he would commit some special acts on himself, if you know what I mean. And when he actually did end up getting arrested, we'll go into that portion later. But when he did get arrested and police were going through the evidence that they found, they discovered 14 of the photos he had taken of himself in these girls' underwear. And I'll put some pictures here for you guys to see. And fair warning, they are very disturbing, and I can't put all of the photos of him on there just because they are too provocative for YouTube. So if you guys are interested, you could easily Google them and see them for yourself. So the thrill of breaking into people's homes and doing this without getting caught was a very big incentive for Russell to continue doing this. So much so that he actually ended up breaking into over 80 homes in the next 2 years across Tweed, where he had his cottage, and Ottawa, where he had a family townhome. Now, during these break-ins, he would continue the same pattern. He would break in, he would look for women's clothing, he would try it on, he would take pictures in it. He would sometimes take some of these pieces of clothing with him as well. And some of the clothing was suspected of belonging to girls as young as 9 years old. And as these break-ins continued, he ended up developing a very strange pattern of what he would do once he entered the home. So once he broke into the house, he would go to the bedroom that he wanted to go to, and he would take pictures of the bedroom itself first. Then he would go to the underwear drawer and take pictures of the underwear drawer just from up ahead. He would then pick out his favorites and lay out the underwear in a nice row, either on the bed or on the floor, and then take more pictures of those. Then he would try them on. It was almost as if he were playing dress up. He would try on the ones that he liked. He would take photos of himself in them. And at the end, he would finish himself off before either taking some of the pieces with him, or if he was feeling brave enough, sometimes he would leave notes behind that would say merci, which is actually French for thank you, just so he could, I guess, terrorize the people that were living in the house, or to leave some sort of note that he had been there. Now, because he was not breaking in to steal a bunch of valuables or to, ransack people's houses, a lot of the times these break-ins went unnoticed, especially if he put everything back and he didn't leave his thank you note. A lot of these times the break-ins were unnoticed and they went unreported. However, there were a few instances, especially where he did leave a note, that people noticed that someone had broken in, although they didn't fully understand why. And this is when people started getting nervous. People started talking, especially in a small town like Tweed, where there's only about 6,000 people living. It's the type of place where everyone knows each other, neighbors are all friends, and it just started making people very uncomfortable, to the point where they started suspecting, each other of being the one breaking into people's houses. In 2009, Russell needed a little bit more stimulation. So he decided to break into the homes of women while they were still in the house. And a few examples of this was when women would be taking showers, he would be stalking them outside of their home. And when he noticed that they had gone into the shower, he would break into the house, commit the regular pattern that he had gotten used to, and then leave before the woman was finished in her shower. And if that wasn't disturbing enough, he was said to have kind of stalked this young girl, and she was said to have only been about 12 years old. And he had followed her to her house, figured out where she lived, and he came back one night and just stared at her from the outside, and she never noticed. But he would later confess that he would stand outside her window and watch her in her bedroom, watch her get undressed while he pleased himself outside in the dark. But as you can imagine, he was getting worse and worse. His need for more started intensifying, and that's when he decided that he needed to become much more physical. On September 17th, 2009, Russell decided to break into the home of a young woman living in Tweed with her 1-year-old baby. He had dressed up in full black, and he had even covered his face with a black mask as well. So he breaks into her house, and because it was 1 o'clock in the morning, she was sleeping. So she was very much not expecting anything like this to happen. So he catches her completely off guard, ambushes her, knocks her over the head with a flashlight, and then proceeds to tie her up. Once he has her completely tied up, he then begins to assault her. And in the middle of this assault, he would stop to take photos of her in different positions. And throughout this time, she remembers that she was constantly asking him if he was going to kill her, and he would just repeatedly tell her that she wasn't going to. In the middle of all this woman tried to talk to Russell in a way that would maybe persuade him to leave her alone, that he didn't really want to do this. And her way of doing this was by telling him that he didn't really want her, that she was overweight, that she had just had a baby, that, it wasn't worth it for him to do this to her because she essentially was overweight. And Russell's response to this was that it was nonsense and that she was perfect and sweet. So he continues to do what he was doing to her, and when he was finished, he takes some of her lingerie, he takes a baby blanket, leaves her tied up, and then escapes. Luckily for her, she would survive. 2 weeks later, on September 30th, 2009, Russell decides to strike again, and this time it was on a woman named Lori Massicotte, and she was a 46-year-old woman and a mother of 3, also living in Tweed, Ontario. So he breaks into her house, and she was actually sleeping in the living room. She had fallen asleep watching the TV. So he breaks in and repeats the same pattern he had done with the previous woman. He breaks in, ambushes her, hits her over the head with a flashlight. Then he ties her up, assaults her, takes photos of her in different positions. Then he blindfolds her for the next 3 hours and continues to do essentially whatever he wanted to her until he got bored and eventually decided to leave. And the worst part of all of this is that he actually only lived 3 doors down from this woman. Then things escalated severely on November 16th, 2009. So there was a colleague that worked with Russell, and her name was Corporal Marie-France Como. And she was actually a military flight attendant and worked at the same base as Russell in Trenton, Ontario. During what seemed like a completely innocent conversation, she made a very big mistake. She had ended up telling Russell that she lived alone and that she had 2 cats. And this to Russell was like striking gold. It was the perfect victim for him because he knew that nobody else would be in the house and nobody would be able to stop him. However, he wanted to make sure that she was telling the truth. So a few nights before he attacks her, he had actually gone to her house when she wasn't home. He breaks into her house to make sure that she was actually telling the truth. And to his surprise, she was living alone. He sees her 2 cats and then goes into her bedroom to look at her underwear, tries it on, takes a few pictures of himself in it, and then leaves. 8 days later, on November 24th, he decides to break into Maddie's home for the purpose of attacking her. So he breaks in and he hides in the basement for about 30 minutes, waiting for her to come home. And when she does finally arrive home, he ends up ambushing her and hits her over the head with a flashlight again, which ended up knocking her unconscious. So while she's passed out, he ties her up, he puts duct tape over her mouth, and he covers her head. He then drags her body upstairs and starts taking pictures of her. Once he's done with that, he starts setting up a video camera and then proceeds to assault Marie over and over and over again. However, Maddie did not go down without a fight. She definitely fought for her life. There was signs of a very big struggle, and Russell later on in his confessions, he would say that she begged for her life. She begged him to let her live, but he just told her to shut up, to stop talking, and he proceeded to not only duct tape her mouth even more, but then duct taped her nose completely shut, and she ended up suffocating to death. After she had died, he cleaned himself up and literally just left her body in her house and then drove to Ottawa for a meeting like nothing had ever happened. It was suspected that after his first kill, that it had somehow quenched his thirst for what he was looking for, because he didn't do anything. He didn't break into anyone's home for the next 2 months. Then on January 27th, 2010, Russell decided it was time to look for his next victim. And he happened to be in Belleville, and he was driving down the street when he noticed a woman inside her home who happened to be working out on her treadmill. And when he saw her, she immediately caught his attention, and he remembers thinking that he thought that she was cute. And so with that, he decided that this woman, whose name was actually Jessica Lloyd, would be his next victim. The next night, he breaks into her house and repeats the exact same pattern. He hits her over the head, he tapes her mouth shut, he blindfolds her, he ties up her hands, sets up his video camera, starts taking pictures of her, himself, and then he proceeds to videotape him assaulting her over and over again. After 20 hours of this, he told Jessica that he was going to let her live, he was going to let her go, but it was almost as if he were just trying to torture her, because he did the exact opposite. Instead of letting her go, he ends up hitting her over the head so hard that it ended up killing her. And he decided to just roll her body up in a carpet and left her in the garage of her home. He would then leave her body there for the next few days. However, he had made a very big mistake in attacking Jessica, because she was a very well-loved person in her community. She had a lot of friends. She had a lot of family. And, being in a small town like Belleville, it's again similar to Tweed, where everyone knows everyone. So her being missing for a few days definitely set off some alarms. So after Russell had left her body in the garage for the weekend, he went back to Ottawa, lived his normal life, and then decided to return to Belleville on Tuesday. He goes back into Jessica's home, goes into the garage, takes her body into his car, drives to the middle of the woods, and then dumps her body. But this time, Russel had left some clues behind. You see, because it was January, and in Canada, I'm sure you guys all know, there is a lot of snow in the winter. So when he had gone back to her house to get rid of her body, he had left boot prints near her home, as well as tire tracks around the corner from her house. So police are obviously alerted that Jessica is missing, and when they go to her house, they discover that there's been an obvious break-in, there's signs of a struggle, and that's when they find the boot prints and the tire tracks. So with that information, they actually ended up setting up a roadblock on February 4th between Belleville and Tweed. Essentially, what they were going to do was set up a roadblock so they could literally stop every single car that would be transitioning from both towns and question each person to see if they could find a potential match to these tire tracks. And believe it or not, Russel actually ended up getting stuck in that roadblock. And unfortunately for him, he was driving the same car that he had used the night he had gotten rid of Jessica's body. And when it came time for him to talk to the police on the road, one of the police officers noticed that the tires looked very similar, so they decided to schedule a second interview with him in the next few days. On February 7th, Russel is scheduled for an interview at the Ottawa police station, and he shows up. He shows up very confidently, like nothing is wrong. And at the beginning of his interview, he presents himself very confidently, very calmly. However, the detective James Smith knew there was something wrong here. He could just sense it. So right away, he offers Russel a lawyer, but Russel declines to have one. I guess this was part of his act because he didn't want to come off as guilty. He wanted to pretend like there was nothing wrong, so he wouldn't really need a lawyer. So they proceed with the interview, and they start asking Russel about what he had done that previous week, and the detective is taking his notes. And Russel, at one point, because he was such a well-respected member of the military, asks the detective if he wouldn't mind keeping this entire situation discreet, because it's not that he had done anything wrong, it's because he just didn't want to embarrass the military or himself. The detective then says that they would try their best, but he already had another plan in mind. So the detective lets Russel tell his entire fake story, and when he was done, he finally presents him with the facts. He starts by telling him that the tires found at Jessica's home, the tire prints, were a match to the ones on his Pathfinder. Then he tells him that they had a witness that remembered seeing a Pathfinder that looked very, very similar to the one he has, leaving Jessica's home on the night that she disappeared. He then showed him a photo of the boot prints they found outside of Jessica's home, and coincidentally, Russel had actually made the mistake of wearing the exact same boots to his interview, where the police told him that they were an exact match. And as you can see in these still images of the interview, which actually ended up lasting about 10 hours, you can see that Russel goes from being calm and relaxed and confident to then sitting with his arms completely crossed. And at one point, he just got very, very quiet. And all he could say to Smith is that he didn't know what to say anymore. This continues on for a few more hours. Russel sits in complete silence, just thinking about his options. Detective Smith then shows him something else. He puts forward a search warrant for his home in Ottawa, and he tells him that his wife was fully aware of what was happening, and that at that very moment, not only were they searching his home, but they were also confiscating his car. And the part that finally pushed Russel over the edge is that they told him that they had found some DNA on Maddie's body and that they were going to run some tests on it, and they were expecting those extra DNA samples to match Russel. With all this evidence being presented to him at the same time, Russel finally just snaps, he breaks down, and he tells the detective that he'll confess because he wants to do as much as he can to minimize the impact of all this on his wife. He then tells Smith where to find Jessica's body in the forest, and he starts detailing about how many break-ins he had committed, how he did them, what he did inside, and he even told them about all of the photos and the camera chips and exactly where to find them inside of his home in Ottawa. Of course, the detective was extremely curious about why anyone would do something like this. So he proceeds to ask Russell why he did this, and all he could say was that he didn't know and it didn't really matter anyways. So in 2010, Russell ends up pleading guilty to all the charges against him, and he ends up getting sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences. And on top of this, he was also dishonorably charged from the military and had all of his rankings, his medals, and titles stripped from him. But the biggest question in this case remains why. We never really got a full answer from Russell as to why he would commit these crimes. But that doesn't stop people from developing their theories, both in the professional and in the amateur realms. So like I was saying earlier in the video, it's very rare for anyone to suddenly start committing crimes in their 40s, especially very, very heinous crimes like the ones Russell committed, especially because he didn't have a history of any criminal behavior in the past. In fact, it was quite the opposite for Russell. He had a history of being a top-notch citizen. Not only was he highly competent, he was very well respected in the military. He had one of the highest rankings possible. He was friendly. He participated in multiple fundraisers. He had a lot of friends. He had family, and he was generally on good terms with everyone he knew. Most people seem to speculate that there must have been some sort of triggering event that caused him to just completely lose control. Some speculate that it had something to do with a cat of his that he died. However, this is also contradicted because they say that he had already started committing these crimes when his cat had died. However, the theory still relies on the idea that something must have happened to him, and this is kind of strengthened a little bit more based on something that he said to one of the women he was attacking. In the middle of assaulting one of the women, she asked him why he was doing this, and his response to her was that he needed to do this so he could move on with his life. However, we don't have any sort of explanation or further understanding on what that could have potentially meant. So I guess my question to you guys is, why do you think he did all of this? What makes someone suddenly just completely snap and start committing these crimes? All right, so that does it for today's video, guys. Thanks so much for joining me. And again, if you have any other case suggestions, leave them in the comments below. Don't forget to check me out on TikTok. There's different videos on there that are not on my YouTube, and there's also shorter summary versions of some of the videos on my YouTube. All right, guys, I will see you in the next one.